In previous lessons this week, you learned about how to use inline styles as well as ID, class, and element selectors to target elements to apply styles. In this lesson, I will introduce you to some of the more advanced selectors, including grouping selectors, pseudoclasses, attribute selectors, and combinators. At the end, we'll circle back to the specificity point system I talked about in part 1. And I'll discuss the concept of CSS inheritance as well. Grouping selectors let you apply the same rule set to multiple selectors at once. This is also known as using a selector list. To do so, you write each selector on the same line, separated by a comma, like this. This is equivalent to writing this. That's the grouping selector. Next, let's talk about pseudoclasses. Pseudoclasses are a way of narrowing down elements to those that are in a particular state. Pseudoclasses are not used on their own, but with other selectors. The syntax looks like this. Selector, followed by the pseudoclass name. For example, hover is a pseudoclass, and you would use it like this. Div, hover. This will only select for div elements that are being hovered over. A couple of other useful pseudoclass examples are focus and visited. They could be used like this. Input, focus, would select whichever input element currently has focus. A, visited, would select for only the anchor links that have been previously clicked on. Pseudoclasses can be used on any kind of selector, not only element selectors. For example, .my-class hover would only select for elements with the class of my-class that are being hovered over. Attribute selectors let you choose elements based on what attributes they contain. You can specify the attribute name only, or you can even narrow it down to attributes with a certain value. Like pseudoclasses, they don't exist on their own, but are attached to a selector. The syntax is selector, then the attribute, with or without the value, inside square brackets. Here's a few examples. This would select for all div elements with a length attribute. This would select for any inputs with the type of submit. And this would select any element with a class of my-class and an attribute of required. Combinators allow you to combine multiple selectors together. There are 4 combinators: the descendant selector, the child selector, the adjacent sibling selector, and the general sibling selector. For the descendant selector, use 2 selectors separated by a space. For example, this selector, form space div, will only select div elements that are inside form elements. It can be, but does not have to be, an immediate child of the form element. That is, it could be inside some other element, like a field set, that's itself inside a form element. For the child selector, use the greater than symbol. For example, this selector, body greater than h1, will only select h1 elements that are direct children of the body element. That is, there is no other level of nesting between the h1 and the body. It's not a grandchild or great-grandchild, it is a direct, immediate child. For the adjacent sibling selector, use a plus sign. For example, this selector, P plus image, will only select image elements that come right after a paragraph element. For the general sibling selector, use a tilde. For example, this selector, P tilde image, will select any image elements that come after a paragraph element, but not necessarily right after. Now that you understand the many different kinds of selectors that can be, Let's bring it back to the topic of specificity. I mentioned in part 1 that you can figure out specificity using point values: 1000 for inline styles, 100 for ID, 10 for class, and 1 for element. In this point system, the attribute selectors and pseudo-class selectors are considered the same level of specificity as class selectors, so they are worth 10 points each. These selectors used in grouping selectors are counted individually, the same as if they were written in separate rule sets. But selectors and combinators are counted together. Let's put this knowledge to use. Take a look at these two selectors. Which one do you think has higher specificity? Let's count the first one. Form is an element selector, so that's 1 point. Input is another element selector, so that's 2 points. And finally, required is an attribute selector, so that's 10 points, for a total of 12. The second selector, input: focused, has an element, input, so that's 1 point. And focused is a pseudo-class for 10 points. That means this has 11 points, giving it a lower specificity than the first selector. Knowing even a little about how specificity and selectors work in this way will be very helpful to you in your journey of learning CSS. I want to discuss one last thing briefly in this lesson, and that's the concept of CSS inheritance. This is another key point that you need to understand about the CSS cascade. There are some CSS properties that are inherited from the parent element to its child elements. For instance, if I set the color property on an element, such as this div element, all the child elements will inherit that color property as the default. So here, the text inside this span element will be blue because it will inherit the color from the div, even though there is no color set on the span element itself. Inherited properties have very low specificity, so if I set a color on the span element, then it will override the inherited color. Only some properties are inherited in this way. For example, if I set a border property on the div element, the span element will not inherit it. You can tell because otherwise there would be 2 borders here, and there's only 1. We've now come to the end of this lesson. You have gained a great deal of understanding about CSS and how it works this week. Make sure to complete the code challenge and challenge questions for this week to deepen your understanding even further.